two Time Lords, both looking for something they'll never find on Gallifrey, hoping to find themselves and so much more, stolen away into intrigue and adventure, all according to plan. Stolen Hearts, The Invitation, a Gallifreyan love story, by Edward Winterrose, starring Edward Winterrose and Jennifer Anderson. Well, she had to do something, didn't she? The artist looked out onto the plane of wild endeavor spilling into the missing fourth wall of her quarters. She knew her quarters were actually 20 levels below the surface of the planet, so far beneath the Citadel it could be a dungeon. But the wall was a combination of holographic trickery and some dimensional engineering to simulate as much of that wide-open space as it could. She got the spicy smell of the red grass on occasional breezes. The only problem with it was that she couldn't walk out into that grass. Not more than a little anyway. She could try, but she'd bonk her nose on the wall on the other side of the hologram. Besides, she knew it wasn't real, even if her feet couldn't tell the difference. There was an expression, the call of the orange. The skies of Gallifrey always shone a distinct orange as though it were locked in perpetual sunset or sunrise. The reflection of the abundantly red vegetation in the more orange desert regions tended to contribute to that a lot, as well as the angle of Gallifrey's rotation to the sun, the interaction of the transduction barriers with the moisture and vapor in the upper layers of the atmosphere. So really the expression translated to the call of the sky. Essentially it referred to the need to go out and wander beyond that wide amber expanse in the stars. She wondered if her capsules ever heard that call. Was it possible that she could transfer her own desires to the capsules she created while carving them? Did they feel? And if they did, was it possible they got some of her own discontent with the world around her? She poked at a twinge of guilt. Gallifrey was far from the worst place in the 12 galaxies. It was a place in which, if you were a member of Time Lord society, you got everything you ever needed. All of time and space was your oyster. You would never want for a thing so long as the thing you wanted didn't involve leaving Gallifrey permanently. She'd gone reading to see if there was a solution. If you wanted the answers to a thing, you'd probably find it in a book. And one thing about Gallifrey, it had an awesome library. She'd looked over the literature of pre-spaceflight societies, then narrowed that search to societies who'd explored their worlds but hadn't achieved spaceflight yet. Peoples who knew everything about their own worlds but couldn't go elsewhere. The artist was looking for how they dealt with their isolation from the rest of the universe. She'd hunted specifically for coping mechanisms and strategies she might apply to her own situation. What she'd found was that a drastic increase in speculative fiction took place in every instance. When most sapient species found they couldn't reach new vistas to explore, they created new ones. Or they pushed the envelope of what was possible until they did achieve spaceflight and could range ever outward. Of course, her research may have been steered by her own discontent, but she was long past the point of being objective in her inquiries. She'd devoured the novels like a starving creature. Not so much for the stories themselves. She was more starved for the feelings of the story's protagonists as they flung themselves into the unknown. She felt a deep longing for the dizzying euphoria of seeing a thing for yourself for the first time. She wanted to experience new species for herself. She wanted to live and breathe in their cultures, arts and philosophies, as well as the planets and environments that had shaped them. This had in no way helped her own situation. What she'd found was that she wasn't learning strategies to alleviate her dissatisfaction with her own situation. She was instead taking on more and more of the wanderlust she shared with those kindred authors and their characters. She was landlocked with everywhere to go. More to the point, she had a way out. Sort of. One didn't just take a TT capsule and strike out across the stars like her thief had. They'd find you. Well, they hadn't found her thief, had they? Her own private and somewhat resentful line of thinking had already found its logical conclusion as far as that was concerned. That it really wasn't a matter of their not having found him. It was more a matter, she thought, of whether they even wanted to find him any longer. Had they stopped looking? And if so, what stopped them? Had the old man done something that had caused them to stop looking? Had he gotten himself killed? Had he gotten that poor TARDIS destroyed? The universe was, after all, a dangerous place. This was an opinion, she noted resentfully, that she'd formed only on facts learned by repute. She got up from her bed and paced her room like a caged animal. The fake wind in the fake distance stirred some fake trees, causing the fake sunlight behind it to flicker behind the fake silver leaves. Arriving at a decision without even really noticing it, she got a bag and started shoving things into it. The bag was a lot bigger inside than out. Benefits of being a dimensional engineer? You didn't have to play by a lot of the rules when it came to physics. Why was she doing this? She couldn't say. We can all relate to that. We've all been there. It was one of those things you did because you could do nothing else. Because with some decisions, in the end, you had no choice at all.
You have a choice. Though I wonder. Looking at you, your choice is really no choice at all, is it?
He'd found Kith in what looked like a hut that was sinking into desert hardpan waste. This was on the southern continent of endless philosophy. This desert marched right up to a blood-red sea, tinted orange by the skies above. Somehow, though, the place refused to be grim. His life, since his ordeal at the schism, seemed to be underlined by pleasant contradiction. This one in particular had all the elements you'd expect of a graveyard. A featureless hardpan that stretched off to the western horizon, sparse red grass patches where the dirt turned to sand, wind in from the desert swirling up rusty dust devils that played around the edges of the hut. Instead, the wind was breezy, not harsh, never enough to fling grit or sand in your face. The ocean had little high crabs up and down the beach. They were stony little creatures that had the peculiar, yet friendly-seeming habit of coming up to one's feet, bapping you on the toes with their great claw, and making a sound very much like a person saying, "Hi!" They never pinched or attacked, so you could wade if you wanted to in the sun-warmed waters. Close up, the water was as clear as crystal, casting wavery gold reflections on your feet. Instead of being dire, the place was nearly idyllic. Maybe it was just him. He'd found Kith himself lying on his back and staring at the sky out on the beach, high crabs playing with his toes and fingers. When he'd approached to make sure the fellow was okay, Kith had leapt to his feet, scattering the crabs to and fro. As old as the man looked, he was apparently spry. Kith had conducted him inside with the air of someone that had been eager to show him something, tittering happily to himself that he had company. As it turned out, the hut was far bigger on the inside than the out. It wasn't a TARDIS, but it may have been once. A thing that, like Kith himself, was retired, or had been put out almost literally to pasture. The place was cozy in every possible way. It underlined how homey a TT capsule could be if a person decided to live in one. They'd dickered around, and Kith had started a simple-seeming dinner. He'd got the makings from what looked like a sunlit hollow of rock with a pond inside. This, he saw, was in a closet off to the side of the fireplace. Kith brought greens and reds and what looked like jerked meat over to a pot. They'd made pleasantries, or at least he'd tried to engage Kith in conversation. Kith himself was all intensity and no social niceties whatsoever. Likeable, yes. Friendly? Certainly. But likable, friendly, and nice were far from the same things, weren't they? Kith had been all earnest questions to start with. Why had he come? What was his business? What did he want with Kith? Had he come all the way from the Citadel? Had he come to disable Kith's Matrix connection again? Was Barusa still an unpleasant and condescending fiend? Eventually he'd dispensed with being friendly and gotten to the point, and the matter of a choice he'd apparently already made. I do seem to have that feeling of someone that's already decided, don't I? He'd been struck by how much like his nurse Kith was in demeanor, direct and to the point, though also a lot more enigmatic than nurse I'm judging you with my eyes. Kith did lack the nurse's ability to not be annoying, but he was likable all the same.
Have you thought where you might go to?
The thought caught him up short. I've just been kind of reacting to the situation, really. Like I'm following signposts on a road to somewhere. And I'm only going forward because I know where I've already been, and it hasn't helped.
I suspect this isn't anything new.
I'm sorry? Kith got up from the floor of the dugout and brushed himself off with a calm dignity. One that said,
Yes, I know I live in what looks like a dirt and brick dugout on the edge of the grandest emptiness. I'm living humbly, but I am still a lord of time.
Kith fixed him with a smile full of friendly solidarity.
Well, from what you've told me, you weren't exactly the mathematical model of contentment before you looked into...
Kith paused, seeming far away for a moment, lost in the vortex. The fellow shook his head.
Pardon me. You've seen what is, but you'd already decided that what is unsatisfactory. You've been offered position and status in the company of beings that are arguably the masters of time itself, and you've found the life they've offered you to be inadequate and suspect.
But why would I look into the schism? And saw Kith flinch a little at the mention of that window into eternity. If the holes in the screen of his own mind were disturbing, more disturbing still was the feeling that the vortex still turned behind the light grey facets of Kith's eyes, and that the memory of it hurt as much as when the old man looked into it the first time.
I'm sorry. Why would I choose to be made a Time Lord if I was going to be dissatisfied with it?
Kith dipped at a table and threw a biscuit at his head in sudden frustration. It rebounded off his forehead and plunked into the pot of stew over the fire nearby.
How in the depths of the Black Star should I know? Why should it matter? You're here, aren't you? You're going to be a Time Lord or not?
Well, I must have... Kith chucked more biscuits at his head, laughing like he'd been confronted with a good comedian.
Don't think! Answer! Are you going to be a Time Lord?
No. Not like them.
Why not? He'll give you everything. The universe will be at your beckoning. Time itself your delicacy. Why not? Because they don't give a damn.
He started trying to catch the biscuits before one got him in the eye. The old fellow's aim was good. Kith slid a quick underhanded cookie directly into his chest, hard. The treat exploded against his vest, raining crumbs all over the floor.
They give enough of a damn to have you followed for the rest of your lives. They give enough of a damn to time loop you in order to protect the sanctity of that precious continuum.
Kith's tone turned serious as a double heart attack.
But that's all they care about. They don't give a damn about the beings existing in time. Just the time and the fabric of the universe itself. Oh, and you do you? You've had half a week to think about this. You've been thinking it to death, coming up with theories, pros, cons, and you don't know what to do after that. So you came to me to tell you what to do, who to be. So you say you don't want to be like them? Okay, be something else. But you're going to decide what you want to be. Don't do it because you're reacting against what you don't want to be. Decide. Do something.
Do what? This foolery was getting serious in a way he wasn't sure he liked.
Anything. But do what you want to right now. Be who you want to be. Right now and from now on. Decide for yourself. I'm not going to do it for you.
So what then? He stood and munched a fragment of cookie defiantly back at Kith, who giggled at the sight. What would you say if I took a capsule and decided I'm going to be a different type of Time Lord instead? And don't get me wrong, I'm going to be a Time Lord. But not like them. I'm going to be my own kind. Kith toasted him with a piece of bread and a pestle of wine and a grin.
I'd say have fun with that. It has been done, after all. There was a boy I used to tell stories to.
What about me? Kith shrugged.
What about you? You want my permission? Subordinates ask permission. Are you my subordinate? Are you my pet?
Kith fetched out a leash from a cupboard. He wondered idly what kind of animals Kith had a leash for.
You want me to give you a pet name and have you heel?
He raised a slightly insulted eyebrow.
You're goading me?
Kith agreed with a nod of his great head.
Yes! Is it working?
A bit, yeah. He tried not to think too hard on it. This following his instincts thing would take some getting used to. Kith sloshed the pestle of wine at him.
Good! Good! I was worried I might have lost the knack of it. I'll have to tell my daughter when she comes to visit. She'll be pleased.
He tried to imagine this fellow in a parenting role. In his mind's eye he saw food fights, shattered crockery, and sparking, broken technology in suites very much like he'd left behind. He could imagine a younger version of this fellow chasing around a girl and then her chasing him, laughing together like lunatics and driving her mother insane. Honestly, the idea seemed like it would be one hell of a lot of fun.
You have a daughter? Oh, yes. She's a nurse or something. She doesn't trouble me with it, so who knows?
Of course. Kith handed him a cloudy glass of wine. It was pinkish red and smelled spicy. Red grass wine? He took an experimental sip and found it to be sweet like chlorophyll, but spicy sweet as well. It would wake you up in the morning, that was sure. Kith seemed pleased at the polite smile he produced at the wine.
Thanks for that. My wines taste like an affront to life kind as far as my taste buds are concerned. But it's something to do. So what about your name? Has one occurred to you yet?
He shook his head. I don't think I know myself well enough to choose one. I want it to be representative of me, one I can live with. I think I'm going to let a name find me, not the other way round. I'll go looking if I get sick of waiting.
Fair enough. You're welcome to stay for dinner. I think I've got some animal jerky and veg out there. But I need a nap. I'm not as young as I was, and it's been a fairly exciting day.
No, that's okay. I think I'd like to be getting back. Can I take a piece of jerky with me? Kith seemed positively flattered.
You like the taste of grass beast, then?
He shook his head with a self-effacing smile. I've no idea. I've not had it before. If I'm going to start trying new things, I'd best start now, right?
That's the way to do it.
Kith punctuated this by hopping into his cot, which creaked menacingly, threatening to break if he kept doing that.
Luck in your steps, boy.
And then Kith was immediately asleep. He was envious of Kith. He looked like he was sleeping soundly, sleeping like a person who was sure they're exactly where they want to be in the universe, doing exactly what he feels he ought to be, untroubled. He had a feeling that if he spent the rest of his lives looking for a place to be, he wouldn't find it. Maybe his place was no place at all, but a journey instead. Now he just needed to decide where to go. After a night of indecision, the artist thought she was finally ready. She'd finally laid down in her quarters after packing her bag. She'd tried to sleep off this critical mass of whatever was driving her out of her door. All she'd managed was to stare balefully at her ceiling for an hour before she decided to stop fooling herself and get up again. She slipped into some unobtrusive clothes, a green suede jacket, a cream blouse, a corset, tan trousers, and comfortable shoes. She could be going for a brisk walk as far as an onlooker was concerned. No one you'd need to notice. Nothing to see here. For good measure, she grabbed a wide-brimmed white felt hat. Suns on other worlds could be a lot more intense than the muted orange light you got here on Gallifrey. Since she didn't know where she was going, she didn't know what she would need. She was doing this. Actually doing it. She'd decided. The idea gave her a mental vertigo. She'd gone to the top of the Citadel once and looked down from the tallest central tower of the Panopticon. She'd stood on the very edge of a drop that would have been in the clouds, had the whole place not been domed in. The feeling had been very much like this. She stuffed every design and drawing she'd ever done into the dimension bag. Clothes she couldn't part with, tools for maintenance and customization, personal things and data she had attachments to. The capsule would have everything else they needed, and then some. It was fully equipped. She ought to know, having equipped it. Looking at what was left in the room, she keyed the final thing. The window hologram on the wall expanded its field into the room itself, and now included an image of her in bed. Given the frequency with which they checked up on her as an undesirable, they may not realize she was actually missing and gone for a month or two. Of course, the security in the capsule bay was something else again. You'd think they'd have better security here in the capsule bay, he thought. Given what had happened in here once, you'd think there'd be armed guards outside or something. As it turned out, all he'd had to do was come down in his official capacity as a Time Lord and tell the computers here that he'd come to select a capsule for a trip. If the computers had been capable of emotion, he'd say they let him in almost cheerily. He was told that all the current capsules in this bay were registered as inactive, and that the capsule in berth 831-2012 was currently in a pre-flight state, and available upon imprimatur and deactivation of its failsafe. Imprimatur? Was it a new capsule? How new? He'd left the bays again, and sauntered along for a bit in under-level 15 until he came to a holopark meant to look like some exotic planet. The park was, in fact, a vast vault beneath the citadel in a dimensionally hollowed-out space. He crossed through until he found a nice public information terminal, and interfaced his sonic tool with it. He probably should have done this back in his own suites, but no. That would be tipping his hand a bit much. The best place to hide a tree was in a forest, right? He could have sent the program he was about to spring on the unsuspecting capsule bay from 20,000 different places on the planet. He supposed it didn't matter that much. Releasing the code into the public nets, it would migrate to 1 million random nodes. From those nodes, the individual pieces of the program would launch simultaneously to 20 million other nodes, and so on, and so on. So that by the time the junk data had reached every computer on Gallifrey, they'd self-assemble and appear to do nothing at all, everywhere at once, including obscuring him from view as he toddled into that capsule that was ready to go. Given that the innocuous piece of software he was about to fire off was going to assemble and launch from everywhere on Gallifrey, he ought not to be too concerned. But he supposed it might have been safer not to launch it within a league of the room he meant to sneak into. Oh well. Maybe whoever found out what happened afterward would see where it came from and find a satisfying irony in it. He launched the code and moseyed back the way he came, back to a nicely blind capsule bay with holocams who were very eager not to record him going into the TARDIS in 831-2012. The artist ducked back out from the corner. An oddly dressed lord had been here ahead of her, but he'd simply walked into the bays. Then he came back out and walked off. Trust one of them to come down here the day she'd decided to take to the skies. Had he been looking for her? Well, he wouldn't find her. He'd left the bay unattended again. She looked at her feet and willed them to move. If she froze now, who knew when she'd get her nerve up again? She beelined for the bay and looked in first. No one. She hurried in, noting in her haste that the smart fields did not register her presence and initiate all her normal work programs. No holofields winked into existence with message boards, reference programs, and all the things she amused herself with in the public nets while she worked. Or, more often than not, sat. She didn't stop. She went straight for berth 831-2012 and keyed the lock with a quadruple quantum cipher index key, and found it to already be open. Was someone inside already? The thought was momentarily distracting, but there was no time to consider. That lord might come back at any moment. She dashed into the Event Horizon real-world interface, and stopped short again. This was not what she'd expected. He was almost disappointed. He'd expect some token difficulty to this. Again, in their arrogance, it seemed the Time Lords hadn't caught on yet. Coming back into the bay, he decided not to tempt fate, and just went straight in. He did a quick scan in the area as he walked through with the sonic tool. The program was indeed telling every security system to pay no attention whatsoever to anything in the room, that in fact they really ought to pay attention to an identical bay in Athenica instead for no adequately explained reason. He walked to the capsule as though he were supposed to be there and was doing nothing wrong. Half of convincing others that you're doing something you're supposed to be doing was, well, acting like you're doing nothing wrong. Social engineering, he called it. The door to the capsule was unlocked. He shrugged and walked in, not really wanting to look hesitant for his non-existent audience, and found himself confronted with an empty room made of ivory, white marble, and brass. There were roundels every now and again on the walls in a tastefully decorated fashion, but no console. Just some nice double doors made of mahogany that led deeper into the capsule's dimensionally hollowed-out interior. It occurred to him again. How new was this capsule? Was it even finished? Maybe that's why it was unlocked. It wasn't going anywhere if it was unfinished, but the computers in the bay said it merely needed to be primed, and need to have its failsafe disengaged. Well, he'd find the control room first. He'd likely need to prime the systems before he'd be allowed to release the failsafe. You released the failsafe first. You have to do that or the capsule wouldn't let you do anything. You couldn't even prime it, the artist thought. When she'd walked into the capsule, what she'd found was a hallway that looked very much like an art gallery, filled with images of her design and imagination. There were also exact copies of artwork from around the 12 galaxies. She'd found these images when she was designing the interior layout, and thought they'd make nice accoutrements for the engineering complex. The problem with all this was that it wasn't how she'd laid out the interior. When she'd entered the capsule, she'd expected to see the console room, not the engineering complex. The interior had been rearranged, and the console room had been moved off to who knows where. For what purpose? Sometimes she'd moved rooms to the real-world interface while working on them to be able to walk in and make hands-on adjustments to a piece of machinery or decoration, but the console room had always defaulted back to the front when she was done. This was wrong, and this time she didn't approve at all. She didn't have time for this. That Time Lord could be back at any moment. She set off at a brisk trot for the main power complex to release the failsafe. He slowed his pace and started looking for a bench. He'd been at this for an hour now. No console room. Though, where he'd ended up was far from boring. The room he'd found interested him only slightly less than actually getting off Gallifrey as soon as possible. After some consideration of the place, he'd finally decided it was a wardrobe. And by wardrobe, he meant a huge garden under a cloudless sky that went off who knew how far into the distance. The horizon was surely artificial, wasn't it? Surely. He'd taken the time to venture in a little way. He noted topiaries of exotic flowers as hardy as they were beautiful and fragrant. There were tiny little mechanical flitters that served as pollinators. They'd have to be mechanical, wouldn't they? You couldn't have insects in a TT capsule. Given the possibilities of mutation, who knew what an insect colony might evolve into if they were suddenly exposed to the vortex? Interspersed among the flowers, however, were different styles of open-air racks and cabinets. They were arranged artistically so that flowers complemented the garments. They were arranged by themes so that the styles of clothing complemented the flowers. The pathways wound around and back on themselves, as though he were walking around in the loops and whirls of circular Gallifreyan calligraphy. He stopped and sat a while on a pillared concrete bench, wondering if his software ruse had been discovered yet. Hopefully not. The program had been meant to self-destruct and automatically delete and format itself from any computer it ever occupied on Gallifrey, and by now, that was all of them. It would even have taken the time to heuristically improve the host computer's performance before terminating itself. Never let it be said he left things worse than he'd found them. For him, that was now happening on another world. Technically, that was happening in another dimension entirely as long as he was in this capsule, but that was splitting hairs. He was mostly still on Gallifrey, and he needed to leave. He got up and walked a bit further, keeping an eye out for a path that would gravitate back to the doorway out. Even that had been a wardrobe of sorts. The door appeared, from in here, to be yet another freestanding wardrobe in the center of the spiral loop he was currently navigating. If he walked back into that, he ought to be in the hall again. Loopy thinking, maybe. If someone got lost in here, or didn't remember which cabinet was the way out, you could be among the flowers and the clothes for a long time. Though, he supposed, it'd be a nice place to lose a pursuer. He snorted. He was thinking more and more like a criminal all the time, looking for possible evasion strategies. If he were reading such a thing, he'd think it a particularly transparent piece of foreshadowing. He got up and admired a rioting bush of blood-red flowers in full bloom behind his bench. It was a soft scent, one that really didn't apply to his memory, an entirely new scent. One might say that they smelled as deeply crimson as they looked, if one was slightly synesthetic. It surrounded some earthy-toned clothes that didn't seem nearly so formal as his own seemed to look. Approachable instead of lordly, a dignity all their own, but not so ostentatious that you'd be pulled aside or given a second look. Well, that wasn't true exactly. You might get a second and third look on any manner of worlds in this, but the coat in particular looked comfortable. The pants, too. Plenty of pockets for useful doodads. A look that could be all manner of things in any given situation. The outfit seemed to have several different sizes and optional selections to put together for your own take, should this outfit catch your eye. He looked to the right, then the left. Just an empty capsule. Him and the flowers. Nothing to be self-conscious about. He started emptying his pockets onto the bench and started to strip, making sure to hang his clothes up where he could find them later among the flowers. Then started putting on the sweet, velvety red scented outfit that he'd found. If someone was going to catch him, he'd be caught. Taking a moment to assemble himself so he would be caught in style would do no harm. He had time for this. She was running out of time. This had to be fast. She looked into the distant core of a room as astronomically huge as a small moon in its vastness. Easily thousands of spans into the distance was the Eye of Harmony. It hung within whirling, orbiting shields, rings, barriers, and fields that separated her from its event horizon. It was a tesseracted link to Omega's impossibly harnessed quantum singularity, emanating light in the distance as though it were still a white dwarf star or pulsar instead of the compacted remains of one. The clockwork rotation of the entire engine and energy collection array was a masterwork of lazy, precise, perpetual motion. It was through this link to the Black Star that the Time Lords derived power for their magnificent machines. If not for the engineering safeties the artist had laid into the room, she'd be well within its gravitational pull. She poked at the holodisplay, which exploded in a constellation of blue-tinted laser light around her. It resolved itself into a wireframe display of the main array before her in miniature. She started swatting away excess layers in the holographic model. Rings and shells tumbled out of the display's field and winked out of existence. She did grab a few and put them into piles of rings that hovered by her right arm. Finally, she found the one she wanted. It was buried 305 layers into the model. She recounted the rings she'd put in the pile, making sure the proper ones were there, then spun the 305th ring anti-clockwise. The rings in the pile snapped into view before her eyes in the shape of the constellation of Casterbarus. The artist smiled at the display, then reached up and rearranged the constellation into simplified Gallifreyan for the word failsafe. Then she spun the 305th ring clockwise again, which seemed to yank every discarded ring and field back into place around it, and changed its color to green. The real array in the distance started to spin itself in a more urgent way, cycling all the way up to full power for travel. Subsystems and other arrays sighed into life, pulsing a basso thrum behind every wall and under every bulkhead. Great machineries within other complexes in the capsule were waking up and getting ready to go. It was as though the machine had only waited for this moment when the failsafe had been released to spring from the planet like a bird on the wing. Where was it going? How was it going? She had to find that console room, and fast. Once he'd found the console room, he'd taken a couple of leisurely moments to look around. The architecture of this console room demanded your eyes the way the need to breathe demanded your lungs. The room itself was a rotunda, done all up in white marble, mahogany, and brass. The columns of the walls stood like sentinels on either side of panels that weren't so much walls as windows onto the universe outside. The windows were pinstriped in swooping lines of inset red, gold, and copper that framed what you were looking at outside as though it were artwork. It wasn't so much a console room as a lavishly appointed observation deck. The round room extended far enough upward that the ceiling was lost in semi-darkness. Hinted at buttresses lurked up there, as well as brass and bronze machines that suited the customized theme this bridge was currently set to. With a setup like this, you'd never be blind to the situation outside. He supposed that was impractical. Some places in the universe were bright enough to burn the eyes from your head. Stepping to the console, he stopped once more. The designer here must have been a patrix like himself. They were always the more artistically expressive chapter of Time Lord society. The detail to which the console had been fashioned as a high art contrivance from an industrial revolutionary level society had been painstaking. Yet beneath the filigree, brass fittings, and nouveau flourishes, there was a fully functional TT console. He swung the view screen controls to fully open. Above him, the vaulted black filled with holographic brilliance. It was the orange, dusky sky of Gallifrey, as though the capsule were looking through the ceilings and domes of the citadel to the clouds above, and the stars beyond those clouds. Within the panorama there was a dining table-sized window that also held a view of the ceiling in the capsule bay. Presumably this was in case you wanted to see what was immediately outside as well. He moved the lever back to its original position, feeling resistance against his hand as it hit several preset stages. The range of the display fell back to planetside once more, then back to the citadel, then to the room outside. Then the ceiling went dark. Shutting off the display fully, the transparent walls turned to an opaque, creamy marble. Thoughtfully, he made the walls transparent once more, liking the idea that he could see if someone outside was trying to get in. No one was. At least, not yet. The capsule gave a more perceptible vibration as everything got a little bit brighter. Muted processes became more perceptible. The sounds of a ship whose power has come online fully filled in all the mute little corners of the room. Did it just disengage its own failsafe? What fresh weirdness was this? Not that he was going to look a gift TARDIS in the mouth. He dashed around the console and placed both of his palms on the contact pads for the psychic controls to prime it with his imprimatur. There was that same sensation of falling inward. That same stomach-robbing sensation he'd felt at the schism. No. Not the same. This wasn't supremely terrifying. This wasn't like being an infinitesimal dot having all of infinity poured into you. This was warm and welcoming. Like coming home. Although it did concern him that the last sound he heard before the room faded from view was a cloister bell. The cloister bell turned the artist's trot into a run. She barreled headlong through corridors of the capsule, which on reflection were looking more and more like her layout all the time. It was very much like it was reconfiguring itself as she ran. But it was happening in an imperceptible fashion. It was nothing you could really see. It was more like something you could feel. As though the light and shadow around the next corner changed before she turned it. Hallways reconfiguring themselves to get her to a destination. She filed the idea away for later. A capsule that could tell where you wanted to go, and it reconfigured its internal infrastructure to get you there ASAP? Maybe an associative layout where you wouldn't have to deal with hallways. She dismissed the train of thought. Console. Room. Focus. Seeing a familiar set of double doors, she burst through them into the console room. The view screens were on like she'd left them. The capsule bays were still outside. The central column was as still as a stone plinth. They weren't in flight, at least they weren't yet. But there was someone in here. On closer inspection, it was that Time Lord from the hallway. He was dressed differently, of course. It looked like he'd found the outfit by the winter roses in the wardrobe. And he was taking her capsule. Well, he wasn't taking it yet, but he was surely priming it with his genetic marker. After he did that, it could go anywhere for anyone who knew how to fly it. Honestly, that was a convenient thing. She hadn't been sure her own imprimatur would work, having been divested of her title. But how to deal with this interloper? Would he give her to the Citadel Guard? Well, why should he? As far as he was concerned, she was probably just doing her job in here. Again, nothing to see here. How had he got past her? Had he been inside when she'd entered? That would explain the door having been unlocked.
Had he come in after her? Well, she wasn't having this. She'd spent too much time in anguish working up the courage to do this. Now that she was following through, she wasn't going to be stopped by this... whoever he was. He didn't seem to notice she was there. She tried a gambit in her haughtiest and most outraged tones.
You there! What do you think you're doing? This capsule isn't finished yet. Do you know the kind of damage you could be doing to this machine?
The Time Lord stood fast against the console, as though he'd put roots into it through his palms. His eyes were closed. His breathing was faint. She tapped him on the shoulder to see if that might bring him around, but he was as still as stone. Cataleptic trance? Self-induced coma? The cloister bell bonged abruptly, as though affronted, like the clapper had been slammed into it hard and held against the inner side to keep it from resonating. A second later, the heavy brass and crystalline time rotor started to rock up and down. The wall monitors onto the outside world faded back to an opaque state to show they were entering the vortex. There was a sound like a key being ground against a musical instrument's bass strings pervading the background. She snapped off the parking brake before the grinding gearwork could strip itself. Then there was just the sound of the vortex and the great engines within the capsule echoing as they dematerialized into time and space. After falling, for who knew how long, awareness rematerialized around him. He was in the console room still, but it felt off, like he was there, but not there. For one thing, he could barely make out the details of the room around him. White light spilled off of every last surface. The walls had all gone a near blinding white. The brass had gone a silver that reflected all the white. Even his clothes looked woven and spun from the purest alabaster white. "Hello?" The walls cleared as though the viewers had been turned on, and outside was the vortex. And this time, it didn't hurt. He looked at it a while, now fully able to appreciate it since it wasn't blowing his brains out. It was indescribably elegant. He felt it was like looking at the clockwork motion behind space and time. It was the pivot upon which worlds and universes turned, where every decision created a new universe, or an infinitude of infinities that exponentially grew and grew. It was so much bigger than he was prepared for. Even his senses, with all they could see and understand. He knew those senses weren't physically equipped for this, that they would only let him perceive the smallest, merest fraction of it. His universe was impossibly small, and every living being in it was smaller still. More to the point, every moment and possible moment was here too, yet each of these moments spawned another sprawling and endless universe in its wake. Every littlest thing was important, and if moments were important, and the decisions made in those moments were more important still, how crucial were the beings in those countless realities that made those decisions? It was impossibly beautiful. No, he couldn't see all of it, but he could try to see as much of it as he could. He would surely make sure that nothing harmed it while he lived. "You're right," he said to the brightness around him. "I wouldn't be satisfied with anything less." The cloister bell stopped, and the Time Lord started to fall over backwards. His head fell against her chest, so she changed his angle so he wasn't face first into her décolletage. She leaned him back to look his face over. Not bad at all. There was a bit of a nose on him, but only a bit. He had brown hair with hints of blonde and red in. There was an old scar on his right cheek that he must have got while he was young, as well as a furrow in the left of his brow. There wasn't any darkness about him at all. Nothing that seemed like a person to be afraid of. He just didn't have the face for it. He'd really have to work at it to intimidate or scare anyone. His eyes were still closed, but they were busy showing a lot of REM beneath the eyelids. She considered the ringing of the cloister bell. The cloister bell was the one alarm you never ignored in a TT capsule. The cloister districts of a TARDIS's interiors were the places where all the most important workings were.
If any species of prescience dwelled in the heart of any TARDIS, it was down in the cloisters. And the cloister bell, that only rang in the event of wild and unplanned-for danger, or imminent destruction. And with the capsule sailing smoothly along in the vortex, nothing wild or unplanned for seemed to be going on at the moment. The capsule chose that time to give a mighty lurch, causing her to stumble backwards on a floor that had dropped into a 45-degree slope. She tried to right herself, but between her trying to keep her balance and not drop the unconscious Time Lord, she knew she'd momentarily be on her back, sliding backward. The last thing she saw was that unthreatening face rushing toward her own. Their foreheads met with a tooth-rattling bonk, and the universe around her faded to white. He regarded the woman that had abruptly appeared in the half-blinding whiteness. He'd felt a sudden jolt like you get when you bonked your head on something, only without any of the pain. Then, just as suddenly, there she was. A woman of some indeterminate... No, not indeterminate. Casting out his feelings in her direction, she was definitely Gallifreyan. What was she doing here? Was this the voice he'd heard in the schism? After a moment, he thought not. The look of bewilderment on her face as she sat up was very like his must have been when he'd seen the console room clad all in white around him. His first thought was to try and comfort her.
Hello? Hi there. I'd introduced myself, but I've had a problem with that lately.
She shook her head side to side for a moment as though trying to clear it.
Yeah, the schism really knocked you for a loop.
After a moment, she seemed shocked that she'd said that aloud. He blinked.
I'm sorry, have we met? You've heard about my right?
She looked at him with stormy blue-gray eyes that were half understanding, half confusion.
No. Well, yes and no, I think.
He nodded and helped her up.
Well, since I've no name to give you, how about you tell me yours and we'll see what can be done for your confusion. Are you okay?
I'm a bit wobbly, but okay.
She shook her head to clear the cobwebs.
You hit me in the head.
He raised an amused and surprised eyebrow.
Did I now? And here I thought I was a more polite being than that.
Well, it wasn't your fault. You were comatose at the time. You were connected to the psychic panel of the capsule. I kind of caught you when we dematerialized, and you collapsed. The capsule gave a lurch, and you went face first into my forehead.
She seemed vaguely embarrassed and upset about something. Well, he was embarrassed.
Well, inasmuch as I am responsible for that, I'm sorry I seem to have knocked you out, especially in the process of creating a telepathic bond with you.
The artist looked at him sideways.
Bonding by headbutt? I thought that was a myth.
He spread his arms helplessly.
Apparently not.
He wanted to make her feel better, or at least get this excruciating look of embarrassed panic off her face. Then he remembered where he was.
Oh, hey, have a look.
He shared infinity with her through the viewers. Time passed in an indeterminate fashion, as it does when you're having a moment with someone. Something you'll want to remember if you're dreaming it. Something you'll want to prolong if you're not. They stood, memories leaking into one another at random. The more they felt and experienced of the vortex, the more intimate the bond between them seemed, as though they'd been communicating for months. Although they didn't really know one another yet. Though, with what they'd shared so far, he knew he wanted to get to know her better still. An hour later, he finally broke the silence and wiped a few happy tears from her face, then wiped one or two from his own.
So, you're the artist then?
She wiped at her face a bit.
I am, my lord.
Oh, don't call me that. Whatever I am not like them.
No, you're not. What were you doing with my capsule?
He raised an eyebrow again. He was going to sprain it if she kept surprising him like this.
Your capsule?
The artist crossed her arms and dared him to argue the point with her eyes.
Yes.
He shook his head, smiled, and took her up on it.
I saw it first.
She smiled back figuratively and took up his gauntlet.
Prove it.
Okay. I heard it first then.
think I heard it in my right. It said something to me in my mind. He looked embarrassed again. I know how that sounds.
Well, I carved this capsule. I think if anyone saw it first, it was me.
He looked a little crestfallen. Oh. And here I thought I'd gotten away from Gallifrey cleanly.
You were escaping then?
After the rite, I couldn't stay. Even before the schism, I don't think I could have. Afterwards, though, my discontent would probably have gotten to me in another 50 years or so. He looked out at infinity again. That's what the capsule said to me, I think. If that's what I heard. I'd never be satisfied again after seeing this.
Who could be?
Are you escaping too? Curiosity spiked the question out of him. He never spoke to strangers this much. He supposed he could be hallucinating wildly, speaking to an aspect of himself that looked like a young blonde time lady about his age. The girl could have been an avatar of the capsule itself, but he dismissed that thought. If a capsule had spoken to him, it would have had to procure his data extract biog to communicate with him on this meaningful a level. The artist felt real enough. She nodded and gestured expansively at everything that existed and will be.
You see all this? The capsules I've been carving should be out in this. We should be too, not mouldering away in our citadel. Anything else is...
A prison. A dusty, booky cage of tradition.
Were you in my mind just then?
I think it's more like that fell into my head from yours. It's not a conscious effort to intrude.
No, I understand. I'm getting things from you too.
She seemed comfortable with it. He hoped she wanted to know him like he wanted to know her, which was, in a word, better. Well, that'll all come out in time, I suppose. This is kind of cheating, though. He looked around the white representation of the console room. Her eyes were startlingly blue against this near absence of color around them. I'd rather get to know you better on our own terms, not have it all fall into my head. Where's the fun in that?
Then let's do that.
The artist laid a hand on his cheek. It was cool against his skin, as though she'd been out in the cold. This has been Stolen Hearts, The Invitation, by Edward Winterrose. You can hear Edward and Jennifer in other audio productions at www.giantgnome.com. Edward's voice acting blog can be found at iwanttoreadthisforyou.blogspot.com. Jennifer's deviant art page can be found at acelsus, AYCELCUS.deviantart.com. Edward's DeviantArt page can be found at winterroseasfr.deviantart.com. The Doctor Who theme, Vashta Narada, was performed by Traffic Experiment, which can be found on youtube.com. This audio play is in no way the production of the British Broadcasting Association, nor is it an attempt to infringe upon their intellectual property for monetary gain. Doctor Who, Gallifrey, and TARDIS are the copyrighted properties of the BBC. The music contained within is used without permission, and is the property of their copyright holders as well. This has been a fan production, and no profit has been made. Stolen Hearts, The Invitation, and the original characters and situations contained therein are the intellectual property of Edward Winterrose. Copyright 2012, and all rights are reserved. Thanks for listening. We hope you liked it.